10 years ago, on September 27th, 2005, Sub Pop Records released Apologies to the Queen Mary, the debut album from Wolf Parade. I was 20 years old and a sophomore in college. It was instantly my favorite record. I listened to it all the time. On the bus, walking around campus, going to sleep with my iPod earbuds in. Along with being one of the bigger indie pop albums of that year, though at the time it seemed like everyone and everything got swallowed up by Sufjan Stevens. It hit the nail on the head as far as what I, and I think a lot of other kids, were looking for from music. Isaac Brock from Modest Mouse had produced most of Apologies, and that stomping mid-range mix that had made Float On a massive hit the year before was all over this record. Wolf Parade had two separate but equal frontmen, with their own styles, and yet they found ways to keep things cohesive between the two of them. Listening to the album could be almost like a survey course in how to distinguish musical perspectives and influences. Conventional wisdom was that Dan Beckner's songs sounded like Bruce Springsteen, and Spencer Krug's songs sounded like David Bowie. That's obviously a really simplistic reduction of their sound, but this was a jumping off point for me. This is when I started trying to listen beneath the surface of music and unravel its DNA. Apologies was also hugely hyped when it came out. Along with the Isaac Brock thing, Wolf Parade were friends with Arcade Fire and a bunch of other Canadian bands, so the music press took full advantage of the opportunity to write a bunch of hacky scene pieces about how Montreal was going to be the new home of indie rock. So, looking back 10 years later, how's it aged? Well, for one thing, Apologies to the Queen Mary wouldn't be nearly as big as it was in 2005 if it came out today. Although a lot of the hype-generating factors, like having a famous producer, connections to other bands, a Best New Music score from Pitchfork, all continue to be a big part of how music is promoted, even more so today. Just in terms of fashion and aesthetics, bands in the mid-2000s were leaning a lot on this kind of feral, weirdo, nature child thing. In hindsight, I think a lot of it was about trying to find some edginess that wasn't rooted in real aggression at all, especially since a lot of very macho post-grunge and metal bands had been popular in the mainstream in the late 90s and early 2000s. The idea that being bug-eyed and yelpy meant you were a smart, passionate outsider strikes me as a very mid-2000s thing now. You Are a Runner and I Am My Father's Son, Modern World, Grounds for Divorce, the whole first half of the record feels like a bit of a preamble because the band is playing it safe. This is where they put all the songs that were clearly meant to be the straightforward hits, even though none of them ever were. In the years after this record, Spencer Krug would go on to write a lot of longer, rococo, classical-sounding stuff, and Dan Beckner would get much more focused and refined in other bands. So plenty of these songs can feel tentative and unsure of themselves. What's clearest to me a decade later is that Apologies to the Queen Mary is actually a big music album in disguise. When I say big music, I'm talking about a strain of pop music that critics have tracked for decades. Epic stadium-sized pop that's more about creating a wide emotional sweep than really bothering to hone in on any specifics. The best examples would be something like Coldplay, Florence and the Machine, M83, Arcade Fire has definitely ended up in this category. The melodic character and the sort of upward motion of a lot of the songs on Apologies to the Queen Mary fit in perfectly with this approach. This record wants to feel expansive and emotional and dystopian, full of gravity and longing. And I think at certain points it still does. Same Ghost Every Night, Dinner Bells, I'll Believe in Anything is rightly remembered as the most enduring thing on this album. It's a direct, martial, explosive song about wild, irresponsible romance. Super appealing to people in their late teens and early 20s. A lot of these other songs don't hit with the same force because they're being held back by this scrappy, noodly production, and also by the band wanting to rock. Wolf Parade's other albums never really got there either. This is their best record, and it might even be the best record any of them have ever played on. There's a seed of a much bigger and more populist album at the heart of Apologies to the Queen Mary. And in hindsight, I feel a mix of affection for its patchwork ramblings and a little bit of frustration that either the people who made it weren't capable or the album just wasn't allowed to blossom into what it so clearly wanted to be. It's an artifact of its time, and still a pretty solid rock record, but it's faded into the background of history, and I think it's going to stay there.